There's something deeply unsettling about a person who can walk into a room and completely scramble someone's expectations without even trying. They thought they had you figured out. They thought they could predict your reactions, manipulate your emotions, maybe even make you doubt yourself with a few carefully chosen words. Then you opened your mouth and said something so brutally confident, so unexpectedly sharp, that suddenly they didn't know whether to laugh, argue, or quietly question everything they believed about you. That's what happens when your mind becomes harder to control. People are comfortable with predictable people. They know how to push predictable buttons. They know what makes you angry, what makes you insecure, what makes you desperate for approval. But when you stop reacting according to their script, the whole little performance starts falling apart. Now they're watching you differently, not because you became someone else, because you stopped being easy to read. You can be intelligent without announcing it. You can be confident without begging for validation. You can see through someone's behavior without exposing every thought running through your head. And when someone realizes they can't manipulate your attention anymore, that's when the tension starts. They expected wins and found awareness. They expected insecurity and respected you to shade you couldn't care less about winning their little psychological game. That's the part that shakes people, not your appearance. No, your words alone, your mind, say sharp mind can make me uncomfortable. More is good and one time where other melts. It catches contradictions. It recognizes fake confidence. It hears what people mean beneath what they're saying. And once you've developed that kind of awareness, you don't have to scream, threaten, or prove anything. You simply see, and sometimes being seen clearly is the most uncomfortable thing a person can experience. So, if someone suddenly seems nervous around you, don't rush to assume it's because you're intimidating. Maybe they're realizing that the version of you they thought they could control doesn't exist anymore. Maybe they're discovering that underneath the confidence, there's discipline. Underneath the humor, there's awareness. Underneath the calm, there's a mind that has learned exactly what happens when it gives people too much access, too much trust, and too much power. They thought they were studying you. They didn't realize you were studying the pattern, and once you understand the pattern, the game becomes a lot less mysterious, because the person who once thought they could shake your confidence may suddenly find themselves questioning why their usual tricks stopped working, why your silence became sharper than their arguments, and why the mind they underestimated became the one thing they couldn't easily distract, confuse, or control. People love predictable people because predictable people are easy to control. They know what makes you angry, what makes you nervous, what makes you desperate for approval. They learn your buttons, memorize your reactions, and then convince themselves they understand you completely. They think they know what you'll say before you say it, how you'll react before anything happens, and exactly how far they can push before you finally break. Then one day, you stop giving them the reaction they were expecting, and suddenly, their confidence starts looking a little less confident. That's when things get interesting. You don't have to become mysterious on purpose. You just have to stop performing your emotions for everyone. You don't need to explain every thought. You don't need to announce every boundary. You don't need to show people exactly what hurts you. Some people only collect your vulnerabilities because they intend to use them later. So when you stop handing them the map, they start getting lost. Push the same button. Nothing. They make the same sarcastic comment. You smile. They expect you to defend yourself. You don't. They expect you to chase their approval. You continue walking. Now they're confused, not if you became cruel, because you became conscious. There's a difference between being emotionally numb and being emotionally disciplined. Numbness means you don't feel anything. Discipline means you feel it, understand it, and still decide what deserves a response. That's a much more powerful position. Anger can be useful information, but it doesn't have to become your behavior. Fear can warn you, but it doesn't have to become your decision. Disappointment can hurt, but it doesn't have to determine your identity. Once you understand that, people lose access to the version of you they used to manipulate, and they notice that insults don't automatically trigger an argument anymore. They notice that criticism doesn't immediately make you question yourself. They notice that you can hear something uncomfortable without collapsing into the need to prove your worth. They notice that you don't need the last word because you've finally realized that winning every conversation isn't the same as winning your life. That's when their old strategy becomes useless. They thought they were reading you. They were reading an outdated version. Because you've learned from every mistake, every betrayal, every awkward conversation, every moment when you reacted too quickly and regretted it later. You studied yourself. You studied people. You learned patterns. You learned that some compliments are bait, some questions are tests, and some arguments aren't about truth at all. They're about control. So now you observe before you react. You listen to what people say, but you also notice what they repeatedly do. You notice when their words change depending on who is watching. You notice when their kindness disappears the moment you stop giving them what they want. You notice when their confidence depends on making somebody else feel small. And you don't have to expose every observation. Sometimes awareness is strongest when it remains silent. Let them wonder what you're thinking. Let them underestimate how much you know. Let them assume you're still the same person they figured out years ago. Because while they're preparing for the old reaction, you're already choosing a completely different response, calmly watching the pattern reveal itself without giving away the part of your mind they were hoping they could control. The most dangerous thing about becoming mentally sharp isn't that you suddenly know everything. It's that you stop believing everything you're told. You start noticing details. You hear the words, but you also notice the pauses. You watch the behavior behind the promises. You notice when someone's story changes depending on who is listening. You start realizing that people reveal themselves constantly, usually without knowing they're doing it. That's when your mind becomes your greatest advantage. Not because you're trying to outsmart everyone, because you're finally paying attention. You used to react to what people said. Now you study what their actions say afterward. Someone can tell you they respect you, but then repeatedly ignore your boundaries. Someone can call themselves loyal, then disappear whenever you need them. Someone can compliment you while quietly competing with you. The words sound pleasant, but the pattern tells a different story, and patterns are difficult to fake forever. Once you learn to recognize them, you stop wasting energy arguing with obvious behavior. You don't need to convince someone that they're being inconsistent. You don't need to expose every contradiction. You simply adjust your level of trust according to what they repeatedly demonstrate. That's intelligence with discipline. Because being observant isn't enough. You also have to know what to do with what you observe. Otherwise, you're just collecting evidence and becoming angry about it. The goal isn't paranoia. The goal is awareness without losing your peace. You don't need to assume everyone has bad intentions. You simply stop ignoring repeated signals. That's a major difference. A sharp mind doesn't automatically become suspicious of everyone. It becomes selective. It asks better questions. It separates facts from assumptions. It notices when emotion is trying to turn a small situation into a massive story. It understands that one strange moment isn't necessarily a pattern, but repeated behavior deserves attention, and that awareness changes your relationships. You stop giving unlimited access to people who have demonstrated that they can't handle it. You stop explaining yourself to people who consistently misunderstand you on purpose. You stop chasing approval from people who only respect you when you're useful to them. You stop confusing attention with genuine interest. You become harder to manipulate because you don't need every interaction to end with everyone agreeing with you. That's freedom. Manipulation often depends on urgency. Answer me right now. Prove you care. Why aren't you responding? If you trusted me, you would. Suddenly, you're being pushed into a decision before you've had time to think. But once you recognize the pattern, you slow down, you breathe. You give yourself time, and time is dangerous for manipulation. Because pressure wants an immediate reaction, awareness creates space. In that space, you can think, you can ask, what actually happened? You can separate what someone said from what they did. You can decide whether the situation deserves your energy at all. That's what makes a disciplined mind powerful. Not aggression, not intimidation, clarity. You don't need to dominate the room. You don't need to prove you're smarter. You don't need to expose every person who behaves dishonestly. Sometimes the strongest move is simply understanding what you're looking at and choosing not to participate. Let people reveal themselves. Let patterns speak. Let consistency separate genuine people from temporary performances. Because once you develop the ability to observe without immediately reacting, your mind stops being a place where everyone else's words can create chaos and becomes a place where you can examine the situation clearly, recognize what deserves your attention, and make decisions from awareness instead of impulse. While the people who once depended on confusing you slowly discover that confusion doesn't work nearly as well on someone who has learned to pause and actually look at the pattern. The easiest way to control someone is to control what they react to. Push the right button, say the right sentence, bring up the right insecurity, and suddenly they're dancing to a rhythm they didn't even realize was playing. That's how emotional manipulation works. It doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it's just a sarcastic comment designed to make you defensive. Sometimes it's silence designed to make you chase. Sometimes it's criticism designed to make you prove yourself. And sometimes it's a simple question asked at exactly the right moment to make you doubt everything you already knew. But here's the funny part. You don't have to respond. That's the power they never expected you to discover. Someone can provoke you without owning your reaction. Someone can misunderstand you without forcing you to explain yourself. Someone can insult you without receiving an emotional performance in return. They can throw the match, but you don't have to provide the gasoline. That's emotional control, not pretending you don't care, not becoming cold, not walking around like nothing affects you. It means you feel the emotion without handing it the steering wheel. You get angry, but you pause, you feel embarrassed. But you don't attack, you feel rejected. But you don't beg, you feel disrespected. But you decide what response actually serves you. That's when people start getting confused, because they were expecting the old version of you. The old version reacted immediately. The old version explained too much. The old version needed to be understood by everyone. The old version thought every accusation needed an answer, and every disagreement needed a victory. But you've learned something. Silence can be a decision. Distance can be a boundary. A dig-away response can be wisdom. And walking away can be stronger than winning an argument. You don't have to prove that you're intelligent by answering their very fullest statement. You don't have to prove that you're confident by confronting every person who challenges you. You don't have to prove that you're valuable by convincing someone who has already decided not to see it. That's the trap. When you constantly react, other people get to choose where your attention goes. They decide when you're angry. They decide when you're distracted. They decide when you're explaining yourself. They decide when you're wasting an hour trying to win a conversation that was never designed to have a winner. Take that power back. Before you respond, Does this deserve me? Not every message deserves an answer. Not every accusation deserves a defense. Not every insult deserves your energy. Not every person deserves access to your emotional world. Sometimes the strongest response is simply refusing to become the character someone wrote for me about it today. You should speak to become about it there. You should be the no needs and we look from this people and really to like now kind of clear bottom and clear ends and that's long to be one and to be speak really will me when we really got it and so what is some of it well you might have my opinion something strange happens. The same people who once knew exactly how to provoke you suddenly don't know what to do with you. Their usual comments. Their pressure doesn't work. Their guilt doesn't work. Their silence doesn't work. Because you've stopped giving them the reaction they were using to measure their control. And once you realize that your attention, your emotions, and your responses are yours to direct, the game changes completely because the person who controls their reaction controls the only part of the situation that was ever truly theirs to control. There is a strange moment when someone realizes you aren't listening only to their words anymore. You're watching the pattern. That's when conversations become uncomfortable because words can be polished. Words can be rehearsed. Words can sound sincere enough to make everyone in the room nod. But behavior has a terrible habit of telling the truth eventually. A person can tell you they respect you while constantly crossing your boundaries. They can call themselves loyal while disappearing whenever you need them. They can praise you in public and quietly compete with you in private. They can say they want the best for you while repeatedly discouraging every move that takes you forward. And once you notice the pattern, you stop arguing with individual moments. You start looking at the whole picture. That's where your awareness becomes dangerous to manipulation. Not dangerous because you're attacking anyone. Dangerous because you're no longer confused. Confusion gives people room to control the story. Clarity removes that room. When you understand what keeps repeating, you don't need another explanation every time the same behavior appears wearing a different excuse. That's the part people don't expect. They thought you'd focus on what they said today. You remember what they did yesterday. They thought one apology would erase 10 patterns. You understand that an apology matters, but changed behavior matters more. They thought a compliment would distract you from disrespect. You notice both. They thought they could create doubt by changing the story. You started remembering the details. This doesn't mean you should become suspicious of everyone. That's another trap. If you assume every person is secretly against you, you haven't gained clarity. You've simply replaced trust with fear. Real awareness is calmer than that. It doesn't accuse without evidence. It doesn't create stories from every strange moment. It observes. It waits. It compares words with actions and allows repeated behavior to reveal what a single conversation cannot. That's emotional intelligence. You don't need to expose every contradiction you notice. You don't need to announce that you've figured someone out. Sometimes saying nothing gives you more information. When people believe you haven't noticed, they often continue behaving naturally. They reveal more through repetition. They show you what they value, what they fear, what they expect from you, and what happens when they don't get what they want. When you say no, watch what happens when you stop chasing. Watch what happens when you become unavailable. Watch what happens when you disagree. Watch what happens when you stop providing the attention they were accustomed to receiving. Those moments reveal more than flattering conversations ever will, because anymore, people don't need you to remain small for them to feel small within. So what? More mobile watch, more useful. They can celebrate your growth without turning it into competition. They can respect boundaries without taking them personally. They can disagree without trying to punish you. They can accept that your life is yours, and people who cannot do those things will eventually reveal themselves without you needing to expose them. That's the beauty of patience. You don't have to force the truth. You just have to stop interrupting the evidence. Let behavior accumulate. Let consistency speak, let contradictions become visible, and most importantly, don't allow awareness to turn into obsession. You don't need to spend every waking hour analyzing people. Notice what matters, protect your boundaries, and keep moving. Your goal isn't to become a prisoner of suspicion. Your goal is to become difficult to deceive, because you trust patterns more than performances, actions more than promises, and consistency more than carefully chosen words. While the people who once depended on keeping you confused slowly discover that the moment you started seeing the pattern clearly, their ability to control the story around you began disappearing. There is a strange kind of confidence that appears when you stop needing everyone to understand you. Not the loud kind that has to dominate every room, not the kind that constantly announces how important you are, but the quiet kind that doesn't collapse when somebody disapproves. That's when people start noticing something different. You aren't asking permission anymore. You aren't checking every decision against someone else's opinion. You aren't changing your personality every time the room changes its mood, and that makes you difficult to control. Because approval can become a leash if you depend on it too much. Someone praises you, and suddenly you feel powerful. Someone criticizes you, and suddenly you question everything. Someone ignores you, and you start wondering what you did wrong. Someone accepts you, and you feel valuable. Someone rejects you, and you start trying to prove yourself. That's exhausting. You shouldn't have to rent your self-worth from other people's opinions. Confidence isn't believing you're better than everyone else. It's understanding that your value doesn't disappear when someone fails to recognize it. You can accept criticism without turning it into a personal attack. You can admit when you're wrong without feeling like your entire identity has collapsed. You can hear someone say, "I don't like you," and realize that their preference is not a universal verdict on your character. That's freedom. You communicate. You stop explaining every decision. You stop begging people to understand your boundaries. You stop chasing conversations that are clearly going nowhere. You stop performing confidence for people who are determined to misunderstand. You people who are determined to misunderstand you. Instead, you become comfortable with a simple fact. Not everyone will like you, and not everyone needs to. That's not failure, that's reality. The moment you accept it, you become less vulnerable to manipulation. Someone can't threaten you with rejection if you're no longer terrified of being rejected. Someone can't control you with silence if you don't need their attention to feel secure. Someone can't make you abandon your standards simply by becoming disappointed in you. You can still care. That's important. You don't have to become cruel or detached. You can love people, appreciate friendships, listen to advice, and value relationships while maintaining your own center. The difference is that you're no longer handing other people the authority to define who you are. You've learned your confidence starts coming from evidence. You know which mistakes you've corrected, know how much you've grown, and how much you've grown. You know the boundaries you kept when nobody was shrunken, when nobody's become stronger than random opinions, and when someone tried to shake you, when nobody was the opinion that's what we own mind, really wanted to shake you. They may discover something unexpected. You don't need to fight them. You don't need to insult them. You don't need to prove them wrong. You simply continue. That's the part that frustrates people who expected your confidence to depend on their approval. They can disagree, and you remain calm. They can criticize, and you consider whether there's anything useful. They can walk away, and you let them. They can misunderstand you, and you don't spend your entire life correcting the story. Because your identity is no longer a public vote. You know who you are still learning to become, and you know that growth means you will sometimes change your mind, make mistakes, and discover new weaknesses without needing to pretend you're perfect. That is real confidence, not needing to look invincible, not needing to win every argument, not needing everyone to admire you, just having enough self respect to remain yourself while other people are free to have their opinions. And once you reach that point, approval becomes something you can appreciate, rather than something you need to survive, leaving you with a mind that can listen without surrendering, a heart that can care without begging, and a presence that doesn't need to announce its strength, because it no longer depends on anyone else agreeing that it exists.